Isaiah spoke mostly or directed most of his message to the southern kingdom of Judah. Part of the reason the northern kingdom, Israel, had already been taken into captivity by the Assyrians. And the southern kingdom's looking towards the north, they're looking what's happened, and they're realizing that not only has Assyria been a power to deal with, but the Babylonians, or the empire, the Babylon, that they were another rising power that was beginning to look to them. And so Isaiah speaks to the people of the southern kingdom. One of the things about the prophets is they're not really well liked. Now, Isaiah's a little bit of a difference in that, in terms that Isaiah came from a family of wealth and power, probably somewhere is involved in the monarchy or the high court. They had status, they had wealth, and it was easy for him to come and go into the kingdom, which was not always necessarily true with some of the other prophets. And so he began to speak to the monarch. And it's interesting that they really had a couple kings, Ahaz and then Hezekiah. And so I don't know if they had term limits. I guess back then term limits meant that you died or you got conquered and it kind of took over and changed. But he was speaking pretty much to those two kings, and especially to Hezekiah. Hezekiah, I think, was a lot, and I told Craig it's going to be a political sermon. You can't talk about the prophets and not talk politics. Hezekiah was looking at Babylon, and things didn't look good. And you would have thought, where do you put your trust? You put it in God. Hezekiah was kind of struggling with that, and Isaiah kept prodding him and saying, you need to trust God. Don't make all these foreign alliances, but keep your faith with God and do that. And it was going along, and then Hezekiah makes a mistake. He invites some of the people from the Babylonian Empire to come, and while they're in Jerusalem, whatever got into his head, he opens the vaults and he shows them all the wealth that Israel or that Judah has. Now, you might think if you've got an enemy out here in the frontier that you wouldn't want to show them all the wealth. And it seemed like that just became gas on the fire. And it wasn't long, and you would hear about the Babylonian captivity. So as you look at the book of Isaiah, the first verses 1 through 39 is kind of called Isaiah. And this is probably the material that was attributed to Isaiah himself. The later portions of that would be Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 3. Isaiah 2 was about when they were in captivity, and that's pretty much a section of book about hope. And then the third part of Isaiah is when they'd come back and they were rebuilding Jerusalem, and it's kind of recording some of the events within what it looked like there when they were building the walls. They were trying to put them back up, and the people weren't real happy when they came back. And it's kind of a class warfare within there, because when the Babylonian captivity goes and takes place, they carry away all the political people, all the wealthy people, all the religious leaders, and they left behind the poor, the uneducated, and those that really weren't going to cause any problems. So the leaders went to Babylon. They lived there some 70 years until Cyrus from Persia began to come forth and rise up. He conquered Babylon, and he sends them back then. Towards the end of Isaiah, we hear him going back. So think about that in terms of where we are as a people and as a country, and kind of we're going to let you preach the sermon here in a little bit as we get to it. But what's a prophet look like? Have you ever heard a prophet? Have you ever heard somebody speak and you go, that's kind of prophetic words? Can you think of anybody in our world today in the last, 30, 40 years that you think might have been a prophet speaking to us? I don't have anybody in mind, but do you have anybody you say, gosh, they really spoke something we needed to hear? Anybody come to mind in that category? Yeah, Julie? Yeah, probably Martin Luther King would have been one. His life didn't end up very well, though. Remember, people don't like prophets. Others that maybe were prophetic, that spoke a word, maybe not on a grand scale, but maybe even within your life, where they spoke to you or to a group of people when you heard them. Any other ones come to mind within there? Yeah, again, who? Yeah, I like Billy Graham. I don't know if I'd call him a prophet or a pastor, but yeah, he certainly spoke some of that too. I wanted to share with you some of the time that I think maybe we heard a prophet in our family anyway. The first one that I began to notice that there's a difference between a minister and a prophet. A prophet usually doesn't stay in the church over a year or two and they're asked to move. I worked with a senior pastor, and I think he was more prophetic and a prophet. About half the church hated him. And I mean, they hated him with a passion. The other half kind of loved him. And there was just that real conflict there. Now, I'm telling you, I'm not a prophet. I tend to be more pastorally. I'm happier if everybody likes me than if I'm making people mad. The reason it's hard for me when you began to hear God speaking is that when God speaks to you, God's usually calling you to do something. It was a number of years ago. I was working at the Door of Faith Mission. It was on a Saturday morning. We lived in Adel. I was minding my own business. Julie had sent me into town. She said, go to the bank, get cash out of the machine, come home. We're going on vacation, and we're going up to Minnesota. We've got a cabin rented, and we're taking the kids. You can't get in trouble just going to town and doing that, you know. So went into town, and I looked over in the Court Square, and it was Sweet Corn Days in Adel. Any of you have been out to Sweet Corn Days in Adel? And off in the corner is this gaudy, awful booth. All colors, balloons, and everything. And so I'm like a moth drawn to the light, you know. And so I walk over to this thing, and I'll be darned, it's one of my ex-parishioners from Dallas Center. And he's running the booth. And I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I've been hired by the casino to get all the signatures in Dallas County so we can start a casino here in Dallas County. And then, in a moment's stupidity on his part, he said, I'll bet you want to help do that. You know, gambling is not my issue, but I remember the words to this day. I said, I will do whatever I can to stop you. And at that point, he called me every profanity under the sun. And I left. And I went home. Jill and I were halfway to Minnesota, and I said, you know, I think I told God that I was going to do something. And so I related the story to her. I said, what in the world am I going to do? And so I thought, I know what I can do when we get back. I know most of the pastors in Dallas County. I'll just call the pastors. I'll convene a meeting. We'll get them together. And we'll have somebody start a group that's going to try and stop the casino. Although we know they're not going to be able to do that. I mean, casinos don't get stopped in the county. So we called the meeting together, and it was like a typical church meeting. Everybody agreed they ought to do something. And so I said, here's what we need. We need somebody that will chair the group to do it. And I stood there with my hands in my pocket, and I looked at them. And like most of you, they all looked down at the floor. And when there's a moment of uncomfortable silence, you know how that is? And you go, who wants to do this? And it's a waiting game. And so finally I said, I'll co-chair this if anybody else will co-chair with me. And a woman from just over by the, well, none of you know where the strip clubs are, but they had a house over there that overlooked where the casino was. She said, I'll do the stuff behind if you do all the stuff in front. I said, okay. Now, I'm going to tell you some things I don't like. I don't like public speaking at all. I don't like speaking in front of the media, even worse. Have you ever been interviewed by TV or newspaper people? The first thought is, how are they going to malign what I said and change it? And the other thing that I hate even more in that, and in the process, I ended up debating the casino attorneys that they had hired from down in Louisiana to come up. I think it was Mississippi. And so we had these panel debates where I'm up here alone, and there's 4 or 5 of them over here. And I began to realize why prophets are not well liked. We lost some friends. Some of the businesses, one of them a restaurant in Waukee, but we won't name it, kind of shared that we really didn't need to come back. They wanted the casino. We began to be a little bit threatened by what people were doing. And it just became one of those really uncomfortable times for about 2-3 months that we were in that. And we knew that we couldn't win. I did make a promise to Jesus. I said, when we're done with this thing, I don't want to do anything that's going to make you ashamed of what I've done or said. And there were several times I had to go to the media and apologize that I had my facts wrong. But here's the part that's prophetic. The annual conference paid a pastor somewhere around $150,000 to be the advocate to the state legislature to bring change. And so he gave us all the information and this bit of advice. He said, whatever you do, you can't mention God or religion. And I'm thinking, I'm a pastor. That's all I do mention. And he said, you can talk about statistics, you can talk about how it's going to hurt the economy, you can't mention God. We didn't listen to him. And so we began to go about, and in the midst of that, in one of the debates, this wasn't my greatest hour, but here's why the prophets weren't liked by the political elite. I remember the supervisors, all three of them wanted the casino. And they were told, let's plunder Polk County, because all their people come out and gamble. We'll take their money, and we'll provide for Dallas County. And I remember saying, I grew up on a farm, and my dad always said, you ought to pay for what you get. And I said, we had hogs, and I haven't seen hogs come to the trough as quick as the three of you have come for this free money. And so it was comments like that that just don't endear you to the political leadership when you make that. The night of the election, I remember 4 or 5 of us were on the steps in the courthouse, and the media came in about 5:30. The polls closed at 7. They said, Bob, will you make your concession speech here? We want to record it, because we're going out to the country club where the casino's having this great big party, and we want to set up and be there. That was some of your local TV stations. And I said, I know we're going to lose, but I'd kind of like to wait till we quit voting. About 8 o'clock, it looked like maybe we weren't going to lose. At 9 o'clock, the TV cameras called, and they said, would you come out to the courthouse, or to the country club, and will you make the speech where you've won? We defeated the casino by about 15%. They had spent $500,000. We had raised $3,500. I've got a gift from them. That night, the head of the Isle of Capri gave me a $500,000 hat. And the media said, this is great. Will you wear that when you make your speech? And we said, no. Jesus wouldn't have done that, and we're not going to do it. And so we made the speech about how God had done that, and they edited everything out about God. But it was one of the few counties where it really changed things. I think that was a prophetic moment in our life. I'm not against gambling. I have gambled. I have won. It was in the newspaper, and one of my parishioners told me how ashamed she was of me, because in Dallas Center, all the local boys got together at the country club, at the coffee shop, and we kicked in $1. If you won, you bought donuts and coffee. It cost you more than you made. Unfortunately, I won a lottery ticket for $50, and they put it in the local Dallas County paper. So this wasn't my issue that I was really out to change it. One other prophet worked at the Door of Faith mission, and we had a guy there by the name of John, and we lovingly named him John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a prophet. And this John, every time he'd come up, he'd stick his finger in his face and he'd go, "Fear God!" For 2 to 3 years, that was the greeting that he gave the staff and everybody there. Never changed. Fear God. I remember one night as a Quick Trip, I was going home and I saw John there. It was raining. And I remember that pastoral part, I like to be liked. I said, John, you want to ride back the mission? Not that I wanted him in my car, but he got in and he preached to me the whole way back about all the things that are wrong with the country and the economy and me, and he got out. About 2 months later, John disappeared. He left behind over $1,000 worth of woodworking tools at the mission. He left his clothes, and he left the Gospel of John. He'd written a 40-page gospel of prophetic words to the country. Haven't seen John since. And I wondered, was he a prophet, or was he just a crazy person? I say that because a lot of the prophets were looked at like they were crazy people, because they spoke for people that couldn't speak for themselves, and they believed it enough in their heart that they were willing to stand up and do it. And so here's where the political part comes in. If a prophet were to come today, and I do not believe either major political candidate is a prophet. Some of my friends said the only good thing when Trump wins, he's not Hillary, or when Hillary wins, she's not Trump. Those are not great qualifications. 30 years ago, neither one of them had been on the ballot in this country. I used to think that the political leaders took us astray. I have come to believe that what they do, they're a reflection of who we are. They're not taking us astray. They merely reflect our values. I think the prophets in the Old Testament were speaking there. What would you say a prophet sent from God might speak to us in our country today that we need to look at? What would be some of the things that they might lift up, if you were guessing, that God is not happy about? And these are historical things that the prophets and Jesus have talked about for years. I'll give you hints. What might be one of them? And while you're thinking, you're always supposed to give the first one, so I'll give it. At annual conference this year, the conservative group and the liberal group were side by side, and they had their banquets. They both paid $32 for that meal. I sat in that room and I looked at the people that were serving. One of them was a skinny 18, 20-year-old kid. Pants were ready to fall off, but he had the belt pulled up and the pants looked like about 3-4 sizes too small. Another one was a young girl. She looked like vampires were her boyfriends by the looks of her neck. Another one was a 60, 70-year-old lady that should have been home, probably retired. These were the people serving us. And I have said both to the conservatives and the liberals, I've talked to them, I said, don't you think we maybe could agree that we won't have those meals anymore unless those people have a living wage? Maybe $15 an hour is not out of line for those people that are serving us if Hy-Vee can make $32 on a meal. I think that might be one thing that God would speak about. What are others? What are other things in our country or our society that the prophets might speak against? What do you think they'd lift up? And I like silence, so I've got all night, so. We need to care about each other. Yeah. Even if we don't agree with what the other person said, maybe we don't talk about that part of it, but we find common ground where we can. And we realize, I don't have to agree with everybody on everything. You had a suggestion in the back here? Yeah. I think that's a big one, learning to get along with people. Any of you ever been, I'll rephrase that. Any of you ever visited people in prison? You ever been there in prison? Prison reform is something we need to deal with. We incarcerate more people in this country than any other major country in the world, including the Soviet Union. And they get out, but they don't get out better. And the majority of them do not look like us. They're people of color. We went into Cook County Jail, Julie and I, on a mission experience. And there were 20 kids in each of the pods. They were all 12 to 17 years of age. 19 of them were black. One of them was Hispanic. You had to look to find a white kid in there. And they were in there for murder and all different kinds of things. And they were just young kids that were scared to death. What other things, when you look around in society, might we address? And I'm saying, yeah, what? Respect, yeah. We've lost that. Yeah, for our elders. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe rather than quit giving them everything, maybe we do give them everything. It's what we're giving them is important. You know, that we go back to some of those things. I worked in a mission for 10 and a half years, the Door of Faith downtown. The library is there now, if you wonder where it's at down there. And we had a black gentleman. And he came in, he said, Bob, could I teach you about prejudice? He had been under Governor Ray, maybe, the head of the whole division for race relations. He'd been one of the chairs, living in a mission. How that ever happened, I don't know. Joe taught me that I'm prejudiced. And an example that I thank God I'm not born a black man. Because if I were, my life would have been so much more difficult than what it is today. He taught me what it meant to have a friend, and friendship and love. And we became really close. He said, he also taught me how to dress. He said, can I buy your clothes for you over at the outlet store and let me pick it out? You don't know how to dress. And so when the good suits came in, Joe bought them. I took them and had them tailored. But Joe taught me that respect and that dignity and those common things as we did that. I think there are a lot of things in the world today that a prophet would come and speak that would be exactly what Isaiah was speaking to the monarchy at that time. Things are broken. I don't believe that either political party or candidate is going to fix it. I have absolutely no hope in the political system until we find our way back to God and we begin to do some of those things like respect and listen and care and love one another. We serve the poor. We speak for those that can't speak for themselves. And we begin to stand up and be what the church was called to be. I think we're in trouble. I think that we are in deep trouble as a country. Isaiah spoke that to the nation of Judah. He would live to see captivity, to where the country would fall, and for 70 some years they would be living in another country, and even when they went back, it still wasn't like it had been. And as you begin to look at those prophets, it's over and over and over that money and power and prestige are not the way, that the answers come with God, and that it's only through our faith and our trust in God that we begin to find a new way of living with one another. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be in politics, because you should. And I'm not saying you shouldn't vote, because you should. I think you need to actively be involved and to do that. But I think we need to call them and we need to push them to where they're really uncomfortable and say, but how would you do that? How would you care for those kind of folks that are in these places? When you go to Detroit, depending what part of the city you're in, you're going to see what life can become. You know, you can buy a 2-3 bedroom home in Detroit for $100 because nobody wants to live there. Neighborhood and blocks of the city are in desolation because nobody wants to be there. And then there's other parts that are different too, but you'll see what it's like to go into those places where there's brokenness and despair. And then I want to read a couple of the words from Isaiah, and I think you're going to recognize some of those. And these are the ones where hope begins to come through. The first one is from Isaiah 50, verse 6. And I suspect you're going to recognize many of these, especially if you've been at Christmas Eve service. You know, these are some of the suffering servant passages and some of the ones that we say point to Jesus when he was coming. The other thing they tell you in seminary, you should mark the pages in your Bible. Anyway, have you ever heard this one? I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. And those were some when Jesus was crucified. And then Isaiah 58, 66 and 7. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your home, and when you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? And you remember some of Jesus' words where he talked about that. And then the third one is Isaiah 61, 1 through 2. Sounds an awful lot like Isaiah when Jesus shared some of this. He said, the Spirit of the Lord of God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. When you read in Isaiah, towards the end of Isaiah, you begin to hear a different hope. And I don't know that it's the hope for the world as much as the hope for those that have found their way to God.